because there's the bearded Jesus that is normally the version you might see now, this well-bearded man that has his own kind of...
that, well-bearded. He is well-bearded.
And a clean-shaven Jesus is very different.
As opposed to Isaiah, where I think it's patchy. I think that
feels very different.
To say the beard is patchy.
Why does Jesus have a magic wand in early artistic depictions? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the lands, civilizations, and archaeology of the Bible. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Robyn Walsh for a conversation about early artistic depictions of Jesus. Specifically, what's going on with the thing in Jesus' hand? Is it a wand? Is it a staff? What is it doing? What is it supposed to mean? And where do we go with this? I think you are really going to enjoy this conversation if you are interested in anything having to do with depictions of Jesus or our understanding of the early Christian community. Remember, for early access to ad-free video podcasts and exclusive bonus content, like a bonus podcast, you can join us over on Patreon. We are Bible and Arc on Patreon. You can also find our bonus podcast in our YouTube memberships if you would prefer. But for now, settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about Jesus' magic wand. Dr. Walsh, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with us today about something that I think is probably unknown to many viewers and listeners of this. Jesus' wand, magic wand, otherwise wand, this thing that Jesus is holding in early artistic depictions. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to come and enlighten us about this today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm really happy to be here to talk about this topic. It's one of my favorites, so thanks for having me.
It's such a wonderful thing to introduce people to, because it feels like a moment where people are going to go, what are you talking about? This is not the depiction that I know or that I have seen of Jesus. But before we can even get to that, can I ask, what is the depiction that we have of Jesus if we just start with the biblical text before we get to art? Because I think we all have, like, we've seen movies, we've seen art, and you're like, yeah, there are these images, and there's certainly a basis for this visual representation that I have. Is there? What do we know about his description from the text?
So there is a basis for the visual representation, which I'm sure we'll get to, because we have to, for people to understand how we're going to go from a clean-shaven Jesus with a magic wand to the Jesus that we usually picture today. In terms of the canon itself, and I mean really early Christian documents in general, it's sort of peculiar. You don't get a physical description of Jesus, really. You have some indications here and there, and I do talk about it in the article that you reference about, maybe he's a little bit shorter than we expect, or occasionally there's some discussion of his clothing or something along those lines in the Gospels. But on the whole, and it is a little bizarre, again, as I say, for an ancient biography to not have a physical description that really is fulsome of the individual who's really the center of the story. Mm-hmm. And because we do expect that from other biographies. The one I usually reference is Plutarch, because my favorite thing from Plutarch is that not only does he physically describe Alexander the Great, but he tells you how he smells. So you usually get a very fine-grained depiction, but visual depiction of the individual you're reading about, so they're in the mind's eye. You don't get that with Jesus. Now, what you do see later on with someone like Origen is going back to the Hebrew Bible and or Jewish scripture and looking for references to what the forthcoming Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, may look like. So thinking about something like Isaiah. And there you actually do have a description of someone who is maybe about 4 feet tall, something like that. I could send you the passage to share. But he's supposed to have a unibrow and like kind of a hunchback and really kind of giving you like nothing wrong with any of those things. But in combination, I think the idea is supposed to be that this person is not physically beautiful. Mm-hmm. And the reason that's significant, I think theologically, is that you're supposed to be attracted to the logos, the message of Jesus, not that he was attractive physically. And you see this in other early Christian texts, that there was an awareness of this. And so I'm not saying that there's a direct borrowing, but one text that comes to mind for me is the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which is a later non-canonical but second century source. And there's a scholar named Jennifer Isle who wrote this great article where she noticed that unlike the Greek novel, where the main protagonists, the boy and the girl, like lock eyes and fall madly in love at first sight, the writer of the Acts of Paul and Thecla is very, very careful that Thecla and Paul never look at each other at the beginning. They eventually do, but the reason Thecla decides to, throw aside her fiance and all her worldly goods and follow Paul is because she hears the message. So she hears him speaking from outside her window. And that's what makes her follow him. So this is a trope is present in early Christian texts. So we don't get a physical description of him.
And in the context of the broader world of literature, I think for someone who is maybe less well-versed in that, if you're looking at just the New Testament, you might go like, well, but there's a lot of people who I don't get described. And maybe you get some, you think like John the Baptist. You're like, okay, we get some things, some garments, but we don't get these, if you compare it to a Plutarch, very specific descriptions. So it's kind of a kind, but also different. So it's not just Jesus that falls into this, or is it more ambiguous around him?
No, I think you're right about that. It's not that every figure always gets this kind of description. It's just that I think within certain circles, there is this interest in trying to kind of peg how to classify the genre, the genre of gospel, right? And so I think our closest corollary, and of course, this idea of a genre of literature is really a modern concern. So you could kind of have cross field literature in antiquity, and people wouldn't be like, but you're supposed to be writing a biography. You wouldn't have had that kind of, it could be a mix of history and biography. That's fine. But I think because we so closely align the gospel with biography, it does become a little bit surprising that you don't have that very detailed physical description of Jesus.
So if we're moving from a very soft description or ambiguous at best within the text, you mentioned here something that I think people are probably also a little surprised about this clean-shaven image of Jesus that we start to have, because there's the bearded Jesus that is normally the version you might see now, this well-bearded man that has his own kind of... I like
that, well-bearded. He is well-bearded.
And a clean-shaven Jesus is very different.
As opposed to Isaiah, where I think it's patchy. I think
feels very different.
Way to say the beard is patchy.
So those things, feel very different than the one we might have. So if we're starting to move down the path to say, well, there's a wand that comes in somewhere, where do we start to get something that brings in a thing we can identify as a Jesus style that moves from ambiguous text to something new?
So I have to give, a bunch of qualifiers and a little bit of a history to get to that. So if we have early Christian art before, say, charitably, the late 2nd century or 3rd century, we don't know we're looking at it. And what I mean by that is we are really quite late relatively into things before we start to really recognize like, oh, this is a biblical story and that's Jesus, because I see Lazarus as like a little mummy, like in his tomb, or I see Jesus turning the water into wine, you start to, or the nativity, like little baby Jesus. It takes a while to get there. There are some other objects that we could talk about that are out there that have been dated to earlier. They're a little bit ambiguous. There's a piece of graffito that you're not. So the Alex Meadows worships his God. So there's a man with a donkey head or a horse head on a cross. So that doesn't help us at all. And then there is an intaglio ring where it seems that there's a crucified man. He may have a beard or he may have a skeleton head. It's a little hard to tell, but we do know that one has an inscription to Jesus. But otherwise, we're really looking, especially into 3rd century, I would say more securely, 4th century, and we're looking at Rome. So we're looking at the Roman catacombs and the frescoes there, as well as the reliefs that we have in Roman sarcophagi. And so those are going to be our main two sources, as well as loculi covers. There are sometimes, like kind of freehand images there, iconography there. So the earliest depictions we have of Jesus, some of the earliest ones, interestingly, he looks not well bearded, and he doesn't look like that, long brown hair or, long beard, but he is clean shaven. And sometimes his hair is like a little bit longer and curlier, but sometimes he really does have like an Augustan Flavian style sort of short haircut. And he looks very much like a traditional Roman male in those depictions. And occasionally, he also is holding what looks like a staff of some kind, like a pointy stick, not quite a staff, like a shepherd's crook, but something that, yeah, is sort of, let's say, amusingly called the magic wand, because as a shorthand, that's what it looks like to us. He looks like Harry Potter, basically. He's got this wand in his hand. And so when he has that wand in his hand, and again, I'm being loose here with that description, he's usually performing some kind of wonder working, right? So the raising of Lazarus. I love those ones so much because it looks like he's bonking Lazarus on the head with with a stick. And then, as I said before, something like the multiplication and so forth, or other kinds of healing. Sometimes it'll be something like the healing of the hemorrhaging woman, where he might have a staff in his hand, but he's touching her, which is clear in the text that she grabs his garment, right? So these little vignettes are present throughout. And I think one way to read this, and it will help us think about why Jesus eventually gets the beard and the beard comes to stay, is that people are working out. We don't have that physical description of him, so we have to figure out some way to depict him. And so you have kind of two channels of choice here that converge. On one hand, if you want to convey something about him being, say, a leader or an earthly leader, how do you depict a leader? Well, Augustus gives us a model, right? And so you put him in that kind of prima porta sort of body posture with a similar kind of haircut, and then there you go, right? Like you've co-opted one kind of imagery to convey something about Jesus in another context. But related to that, and this is why I say converge, you will have artisans, workshops and other specialists who it's their profession to carve these sarcophagi or, make these a mosaic or paint a fresco. And often, they would have sort of a sample book, almost like they were trained to draw or carve or, create certain images. And so within that sort of, let's call it like range of options, you have to choose your wallpaper sample, you've hired Steve, and Steve can only draw, like he makes a really good Augustus,
This is my portfolio. You can pick, it's like going into a tattoo parlor and they've got the book and here's what the artist is good at. Well, what do you want?
Yeah, like you want a Tweety bird, you want, what did I see? Oh, I was at Disney last weekend and I saw a lot of Bart Simpson tattoos for some reason. But they're really good at that, right? So if we want to kind of borrow that sort of motif or, topoi of various kinds into this particular new sort of narrative. And so I think that's what you tend to see. And so one thing that I tried to do in the article that I wrote about the magic wand is, I am kind of co-opting. Do you mind if I talk about this?
Absolutely, please.
Sorry, I just realized that I'm being a teacher.
No, I think it's all such important context, because if you just hear Jesus magic wand, your natural reaction is probably like, what in the world are you talking about?
Right.
But all of these background context things, I think, because our immediate mind does go magic wand performance of things, which is not maybe absolutely removed, but does not have to be all that it is. All of this feels so important to unpack.
Well, the magic wand, there has been a lot of scholarship, but really good scholarship on it, because Jesus is not the first figure, kind of what I was saying before, to have one of these, right? And so I think it's important to look to precedent and do comparative work around the Imperial period to figure out, like, well, who else wields one of these staffs or these sticks, and why, and what's the context there? Because if I'm going to posit that Jesus looks like an emperor because he's a ruler, with the clean shaven, short haircut, I'm going to make a different argument when we get there about why he gets the beard and the long hair. Then there must be a reason for the staff. Now, Peter also has one, more rarely, but in cases of both actually Moses and Peter, like making water come forth. So there was a precedent there. But to me, that wasn't sufficient enough as a reason. And you do see a staff in a variety of other contexts. Sometimes ancient physicians are holding them if they're giving a medical lesson. I think Fortune sometimes has one in her hand. There are a range of options, and we can provide bibliography of other sources that have talked about these things. What I wrote about was that I actually happened to be in the Capitoline Museum, and there's a lapidarium downstairs where they have all kinds of inscriptions. And, of course, I'm down there spending my time, especially because there are, you could call them epitaphs, I guess, but there are inscriptions to where lightning struck. And I find those so interesting. And so I take like 3 hours down there, like reading every single thing. And I was walking around, I was by myself, and there was a car, like a relief for a centurion. So it was a, little memorial for a centurion. And he was holding the exact same staff. And for a second, I was like, why is Jesus bald? Like, he looked so much like Jesus. I was like, this is my first bald Jesus. No, wait a minute. When I read this inscription, that's a Roman centurion. And then walking around the museum, I actually saw another one, but it was like the way that they have kind of, speaking of wallpaper, they were like plastered into the walls of like the bust rooms, upstairs. And I found another one. And so then I started to do research, and it turns out centurions often hold what's called the switch, the centurion switch. And I looked it up and kind of did this deep dive into Roman centurions who used to use this switch reputedly to kind of beat the Roman soldiers into submission. By the time you get to the 3rd, 4th century, Roman centurions are really kind of paper pushers, like they're bureaucrats, but they want to be memorialized in like their full gear with their like symbol of authority in their hand. And I thought it was, again, an interesting parallel that I hadn't seen anybody bring up, that the staff really just becomes this kind of symbolic power, but also a symbolic power that's a little bit more martial and imperial in feeling, which kind of goes along with some of those other motifs we were talking about. There's sort of a almost Republican nostalgia going on a little bit there too. That's being, I think, co-opted into this early Christian imagery, which is interesting for a variety of reasons. But then also, if you think about workshops or you think about artisans and what they know how to make. And so, especially the shape and length of the staff itself was identical. Hand, and we'll show some images, but even like the hand, the way it was holding the staff, identical. And so my argument was not so much that we want to make a parallel one-to-one comparison between a Roman centurion and Jesus necessarily, but that a viewer would have seen this and it would have had sort of an array of associations. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to try to tap into what those associations might have been visually for someone in that period.
Because that array, as you say, of visual associations is so different than the ones we immediately jump to. When you see that, you go, okay, that looks a lot like a wand. It's in a hand. And this must mean magic working. But that there is this different realm of possibilities. Does it shift for those first viewers? Does it contextualize the type of power, as you're talking about, slightly differently in a way that we need to rethink how they thought about the power that's being depicted?
I think so, because one thing that I did see, and again, I'm not saying that this isn't a valid way to contextualize Jesus with the wand or anything like that, but people would often jump to, early Christians were often accused of following Jesus was just a magician, and they've been like bamboozled by a magician, and that's why he has a magic wand. That to me seemed too anachronistic. That seemed very modern, to me, like or maybe relying too much on texts to determine that visual kind of, as we said, array of associations. One thing that I think personally that could be invoked here is I've also noticed in a lot of sarcophagi, for example, and other kinds of funerary memorials of various types, whether sarcophagi or epitaphs of various kinds, stelae and so forth, that not only do you have the Jesus with the wand, but often Jesus and even the disciples are holding scrolls. And also, in many of these sarcophagi for the deceased who's being memorialized, they're almost always holding a scroll. Men, women, doesn't matter. And of course, we know the statistics for literacy in this period would suggest that the majority of these people who are depicting themselves holding a scroll, and certainly the disciples, I think, were not literate, right? So that's also itself an interesting choice to me that says something about cultural capital, if I can get French sociology in here. But that to me makes similar kinds of associations with aspiration, right? So aspiration to certain cultural symbols. And so to the extent that a centurion's staff or switch is a cultural symbol, then to me that Jesus wand, like a scroll, becomes a cultural symbol. And originally my article had a whole thing about scrolls, but of course, like, I think rightfully the readers were like, this is a lot. Pull that back. So I'm glad to have an opportunity to voice this.
In the way we see Jesus holding the switch, staff, wand, and the depiction with centurions as a parallel, are there the same types of moments where it's just him and this implement, or are they always connected to miracles? Because you've mentioned some, like he might be bonking Lazarus on the head, or there's the performance of miracles with the staff. Does that parallel with like centurions doing action, or are they more like just them with the thing?
They're just holding the thing. That's why I was thinking of the scroll often.
Okay.
But in that case, we have to think about context insofar as, what we're talking about with Jesus are, as I said, these vignettes, but an iconographic program that's reflecting stories that people know well and want reflected in these sarcophagi. And even that might be too generous, to be honest with you. I think a lot of these sarcophagi, and I'm doing research on this right now, actually, were what we might call mass produced, right? So I think sometimes we ascribe too much intentionality to what's on these things.
It might have just been what was available on the shelf.
Yeah, I'm a little worried about that. So again, like working on it right now. We'll see where that goes, but that's where like kind of, part 2 of this is headed. So I want to work through that a little bit more as time goes on. But these were, stories that were replicated for various reasons, whether they were prefabbed or not. They were available, but they're an iconographic program with the deceased focused in the center, again, usually with that scroll. And I think what you have with the centurions these are the epitaphs, just to use a more illustrative term for these centurions who have passed. And so I think that's why you don't have them in kind of a situated narrative. They're isolated because it's a dedication to them. Right. But nonetheless, they're still wielding these cultural objects.
In the moments where we see Jesus with it in the performance of miracles, is it more likely to be seen with the nature style of miracles versus, I guess, is there a difference in the miracle scenes themselves that we see them with? Or is it just kind of, these are the trope scenes, maybe because they're on the shelf, and so we just kind of get them repeated along?
So that gets complicated, and I don't want to overcomplicate it, but they're, if I could put it this way, material scenes in the sense that Jesus is performing something that creates a material change in the object or the person. Right. And I think that extends now into like a whole thing of Stoic physics and Middle Platonism that we probably don't want to get into Stoic physics right now. Nor do I know how much people were like meditating on Stoic physics in these cases. Although I think that's certainly present in the Gospels and the letters of Paul as explanatory means for how Jesus performs these things. So often you see terms like pneuma or dunamis, so power, in the texts themselves. But I don't know for sure that that's exactly what's going on. But what you do see is Jesus using this kind of mediating object for material change to take place, whether it is something, again, like the multiplication or the raising of Lazarus or healing. He has that staff in his hand as that conduit, which is why I can understand why magic wands was the go-to, right? Like that's what magic wand is for.
Yeah, if you're thinking about it, if you're looking at this, it feels like it hits all the bells to say, this might be what this is. If it is so many places and so prevalent within this, why does it go away? If it was the thing he's depicted with, and I think we can jump back to, the beard emerges at some point. How does he go from this beardless, staff-wielding, wand-wielding figure to something entirely different?
So it's going to relate to what we were talking about before in terms of there's certain precedent out there. There are certain ranges of, iconography people can, and themes that people know how to use and create in their art. And so the way that I generally think of this, although I'm flexible in my thinking, and I might be wrong, but this is what I teach for good or for bad, is that I think what we might call the theology around Jesus's significance or the points of emphasis change. So when Jesus, for example, starts to get the beard, who else has a beard? Well, Socrates or Epictetus or philosophers or wise men get the beard, in portraiture, Roman portraiture. Because the beard was out of fashion basically till Hadrian, is what we usually say. So the beard could be maybe a little Hadrian influence, but I think really like in portraiture, you do have the beard associated with a teacher type or somebody who's a purveyor of wisdom of one kind or another. So the beard for Jesus as a teacher type makes a great deal of sense to me, or thinking more about him as a philosopher. So I think that that's one place where you do see this shift. Also, you often see depictions of Jesus as we're going through this sort of fitful period where he starts to look like other Greek and Roman deities to some extent. So if we're thinking about the beard, I'll go right to Zeus or Jupiter, right? So he's usually depicted with that beard. Sometimes Jesus has long blonde hair and he's clean shaven and he's a little hippie, we would say. I don't know, how do I put this? He's Zoftig. Let's say he's Zoftig a little bit. I think that he's there maybe looking a little more like Dionysus. And so we do have, again, this range where we're trying to slot him in somewhere, or we're trying to conform to what the artist knows how to make. And Jesus gets these little shifts over time.
Is there any indication as these shifts happen that any of it is a response or a pushback from Christian communities? Like, do we hear anything over time to discomfort in a beardless Jesus or in a wand-wielding Jesus that may align with some of this movement? Or do those voices, largely come in later from people saying, maybe more modernly, like, I'm really uncomfortable with a Jesus holding a wand. That feels way out of place. Let's call it a staff or a shepherd's crook and I'm comfortable.
Well, that's maybe where some of this discourse on like Jesus as magician could come in, so some later theological debates. I love that question, actually. That's an article in and of itself. Like, where's the critique of the beard? I've actually never looked that up. I love that. So I should, or the beardless Jesus, I should.
Yeah.
So I should look into more of that. I'm good with Imperial archaeology. I get fuzzy after about the 2nd century with early Christian stuff. The church fathers are not my favorite.
I was, as we're reading through your article and thinking, it feels like it fits in so well.
Yeah.
And brings in so much context. And it's so powerful. Like it has all these elements of power and prestige that you're like, that makes sense. But then at some point when it slides away, in the way that often happens where we have to then, or communities have to, make a story for why we still have those things. Or do we start to remove the wand from Jesus's hand?
Yeah.
And we can keep the larger image, but let's just, break that part off.
I like that. Yeah, I see that. I also think 2 things. One is that it's not like Jesus always had the wand and that was universal. So, some iconography he did, some iconography he didn't. So it wasn't like there had to be a global choice of like, we're going to take the wand out. I also think about the context again here. I mean, if you're down in the Roman catacombs for more than a few minutes without proper ventilation and you're burning a candle, you're going to pass out. Like, I don't know, I don't know how many people are down there, like, they don't have cameras or microscopes, but I don't know how many people are down there like documenting, this kind of shift in art. So it might be a frog in boiling water situation too. Okay. In the sense that once you get to the point of churches being built and apse, mosaic, coming into play, and frescoes that are no longer just associated with funerary rites, there too, Jesus is often enthroned. He has long hair and a beard. He looks to me like the Hellenistic kings, which is also something that the Roman emperors emulated, right? So the idea of an enthroned Jesus, like in the apse of a church, with now a staff, like a Hellenistic, like ruler staff, not a magic wand. When the iconography shifts from a funerary context of, revivification, if I could say that word, but, like reviving the dead, or like or healing or miracle working, into enthronement and, teaching, And those kinds of contexts or other stories come into play, like, Jesus at the well or something like that. I think it just demands a different context where the implement isn't necessary, but also the context demands a different kind of presentation. So it may be a confluence of things.
Yeah, and there's still like a way to see some continuity there's still an implement in the hand. It morphs and adapts depending on situation and need.
It's still a cultural symbol, right? But it's just a different one for a different context. And so, I think that there, like you say, you see the continuity. It's just different demands. And then after a while, I think it just gets baked in, Jesus, if you put them on column, like the beard encompassed more, right? Especially again, post Hadrian, everyone had a beard. It starts to become fashionable again to have the beard. So to the extent that he looked like a situated first century Roman without the beard, the way that the emperors did and a typical Roman male did, he starts to look like a typical Roman male at the time when Christian art really explodes, right? But then he would be bearded. So it fits. It fits.
And then the beard just stays. It wins. It wins the day. It stays in. It feels like the more complicated thing for the artists to do, which is interesting. They're like, can we go back? The clean face is really easy.
That was easy, just a chin.
I could just do a chin and move on to the other stuff. Are you sure? Are you sure you need the beard?
Yeah.
When modern audiences are looking back at these types of depictions, whether it's wanded or staffed, seated, or bringing someone back, are there any things that you feel are most essential for us to recontextualize that, I feel like we can be prone to sanitizing things when we're looking at them, whether it's by imposing our own structures or our own frameworks or out of discomfort, that by lacking the visual context, we make real problems for ourselves and for the communities we're seeking to establish. That if we're using the wand as a sample, are there other things you think the audience needs to be aware of when they're looking at this type of art?
I think that I'm not sure if this is where you would expect me to go. So if there's something else that I could say, tell me. But one thing that has continually struck me over the last few years, whether I'm working on texts like the Gospels, and we talked about literacy a little bit ago, and there does tend to be sort of a presumption, and totally understand where it comes from, that the people around Jesus are, let's call them humble, relatively humble, not necessarily literate. And so therefore you imagine early Christians usually in our imaginary are similar, right? Because those were the people in the Gospels that were described to be around Jesus. However, we know more about literacy in antiquity, that this was the purview of very few. And really, despite what one might think of Koine, to even be able to create prose literature in antiquity was a huge deal, and a small percentage of the population, and probably someone more elite than the humble masses that we do tend to imagine. Similarly, when we look at this art, potentially the catacombs, you might say there are some more humble representations down there. Of course, so many of them, these loculi covers were destroyed, and we just have an inscription. We don't have iconography. So for kind of those freehand examples of inscriptions and images on loculi covers, we don't have as much of that. When we do have something like a sarcophagus relief, we have to think about the level of, let's call it income or economic standing of the person for whom we have this record, right? Because most people in antiquity pass away without any record whatsoever.
Right.
Or we have to deal with, trends and changes within, societal expectations for things like death and dying practices. So, cremation was the thing to do for a very long time until there were no trees left, right? And then they had to kind of like find something else. And so I think to not presume when we look at this kind of art that we are looking at a humble community of impoverished, persecuted Christians, but looking at the emergence of a class of art that is being not only presented by a higher stratum, economic stratum of society, but one that's aspiring to certain cultural symbols like the centurion switch, or the Hellenistic kings, or the Roman emperor. Like, we're talking about a sea change here.
Mm-hmm.
from that cultural expectation that we tend to place on these objects. Does that make sense?
Well, and a follow-up question I had, like thinking through this was for us thinking through their belief of Jesus, but I think also like, well, their belief in themselves and their understandings of they're making it for them.
Yes.
Well, and I mean, the dead person doesn't get anything from it. So it's the community that's remembering or commemorating, but the way it changes our need to view those individuals and the way they see themselves feels like a whole other side of the question that we can so easily jump past to just go like, well, I feel this way when I see the thing, and ignoring.
Yeah, or we have kind of a preset expectation of like, oh, well, you know, and I'm guilty of this too. Like, oh, look what they love the Lazarus story, you know, like, let me collect all the little baby Lazarus mummies, you know, like this is so cute. Wait, maybe I'm the only one who's doing that. But you know what I mean? Like, oh, these are the stories the illiterate community are telling each other. You know, like it's easy to jump to that instead of being like, and this is the, you know, book of things that you could, this was the sarcophagus available on the lot when you showed up. And so this is what we're going to pick.
Yeah.
And, you know, people, you know, the communities around individuals when they pass also they're making a statement about their social standing. So yeah, you want to scroll, right? Because that's what wealthy, sophisticated people are going to have, whether or not they can read, right? And we make these choices all the time, from how we dress to, you know, etc. And people in antiquity are no different. So I try to be attentive to that. And not kind of preset my expectations for what these symbols mean, and really just try to start from scratch and say to myself, like, well, who are these people based on these objects? Like, you know, what do I know about this time period? And I think sometimes we have a tendency to say like, well, when Constantine XYZ, that's the light switch, you know, everything changed. And therefore we can now recontextualize all these things that once Constantine, again, like ... that explains all of this. Mm-hmm. But that's not good enough, you know, to just kind of make him the point person for such a cultural shift. The shift is taking place over time. It's more like an iceberg than a light switch. And I think that it's detectable in these kinds of objects.
It is also so fascinating to think about the reality that maybe they just have it because it's what was available. Like, well, why are you wearing that shirt today? Maybe it's because it's the one that was clean in your closet.
Yeah, I didn't
and like,
make it.
Like know? we participate in that world where you're like, you bought that couch maybe because it's the one they had in stock and you really needed a couch that day, that maybe they have that object there.
I literally have a couch like that. I didn't
because
want
the
to
person
wait
died.
For the color. Yeah.
Like it wasn't planned. Yeah. Maybe they didn't. It's not a pyramid. They're not building it for years. Like they died. We need something. We're also wealthy. Like we're choosing it. It just moves all of it so much to go, you know, the wand is a fascinating way, I think, to jump in to suddenly thinking about the people, which is, you know, a part that gets sometimes sidelined because the object is so fascinating. Like the artifact draws us in and we forget, there's an artisan who's making it and there's a person who's buying it and there's a person represented by it that lie behind all of these debates of like, well, is it a wand or not? And you're like, there's something to say there. And then all of the things it has to say about those people. I can't wait. If you're doing more on the wand, I think it's a wonderful not wand.
Well, I can tell you what I'm thinking about so that if anybody hears this and knows more than I do, because for some reason I've been struggling with this and I've tried to present it a couple places, but it's really like half-baked. So are you ready for something half-baked?
I'd love it.
Okay. Help me. So one thing I happened to notice, and I feel like this is one of those things, like, have you noticed that bear in the corner? And then once you point it out, you're like, oh my God, how many sarcophagi in museums, and the Getty in LA, the Met in New York, the Capitoline Museum, any place the Vatican controls, all over Rome. Most of these sarcophagi, the face of the deceased is not carved. Some of them are, but a lot of them are not. A lot of them are blank. And I started noticing this about like 2 years ago. And then once I started noticing it, I started to realize, like, wow, more often than not, there is no face on this. Everybody else has a face, but the actual who this is supposed to be dedicated to is still blank. There's a great one at the Met where the guy's face is done, but the wife's is not. And I can only imagine, like, this is wife number 2, 3, 4. Like, he had to leave that one blank and they never quite got to it. But there are quite a few of these. And I'm trying to figure out, is this an indication that these things were prefabbed? And so maybe some of the sarcophagi that we have on display in these museums are actually, like, I don't know where they were found, but they might not have been used.
Right.
Yeah.
Did we end up finding a trove of ones that had been left or had been pilfered and reused for something else and are out of context? Because if you think of, like, if I'm thinking of Greek versions of this, they both have faces. Everybody has faces, like the community of individuals there.
Yeah.
The blankness of it.
Some of them don't. I mean, like, I'm thinking about the so-called brother sarcophagus that's at the Vatican Museum. It's in the, early Christian wing. Because people debate, are they two brothers or is this like a marriage medallion? Like, that's pretty typical. So there are a lot where the face is there. But there are more often than not faces. And so I went through a stage where I'm like, they can't be painting them in because that would look horrible. It would be like, I have it behind me.
Yeah, it'd be an odd look.
Yeah. I mean, did you ever, that Jesus fresco in Spain where that, nice woman tried to fix it?
Yes.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
If you have everybody else carved in relief and then you're like painting in like somebody's flat face, it's going to look terrible. And then I was even debating at one point, like a wax casting that could go on it, but there's no way for me. That's too complicated. So anyway, I've been trying to figure this out because I think the intention, is to create some likeness of the individual once the proper sarcophagus is matched with the deceased. But for one reason or another, it's not happening. But the reason I fell into this topic is looking at the staff, but also looking at these scrolls, because the scroll's there, regardless of who the individual is. And the motifs are there, and the narratives are there, and the iconographic program is there, regardless of who the individual was. And so you can say, yes, the individual's family goes in, or the individual themselves goes in, and they select these motifs. Just as much, though, as you say, if it's not a planned passing, you kind of had a few options. You had these early Christian narratives. People were often also selecting sarcophagi that had depictions of various battles, mythological battles, but also, colonial battles. I don't know how else to put it, like, Roman sackings of various places. I mean, the range of options was pretty narrow. And also in some cases kind of pretty distasteful, frankly, for me. I'm not sure why you would want, the bashing in of the face of some poor, local that anyway. But that's one of the other motifs you tend to see. And so I want to be attentive, to this and think about who's actually making these choices.
Yeah, so in some ways, it's almost like when you get your school photo taken and you can select the background. Like, do you want to be in front of the trees?
Oh, the laser.
Yeah, and like what background, you kind of green screening them into something. I guess could it be also, do we have anything about like the costs of, if you buy the base set, is there any record to say like, well, if you want a face carved, it's going to cost you X? And so maybe
that's a great question. I've started looking into that.
Because like, are we just keeping it like, nope, they're dead. They're never going to know we didn't carve their face. It's okay. We're going to save a few bucks. And
brutal. Yeah. Because also, like, why select the one where you could carve the face and not bother? You don't have to get one with that. You know what I mean? Like, I was looking into relative costs and also looking into, there's a great book by John Kloppenborg on ancient ecclesia. And, you would pay your dues. So in part, so that if you passed away, your family would be, given a stipend, but also they were in charge often of your burial. So I've been trying to figure out, did ecclesia just kind of stockpile these things? And so that they could hand them out when someone passed. There's a lot of questions, what do you do in a mass casualty incident, like a pandemic of some kind in antiquity? Maybe they didn't have time. There are a lot of different questions that I need to continue to ask. So that's why it's half baked, but I love that as a...
I'm fascinated to see where you go. If you have a wonderful idea or recommendation, reach out. Let Dr.
Yeah.
Walsh know. If it's good, I'm sure they'll be happy to hear from
Anything
you.
on workshops, sarcophagi workshops.
If you are a specialist on sarcophagi workshops and you're watching or listening to this, reach out. Let Dr. Walsh know, because that would be fascinating to hear, because it is weird. I can't say I've ever noticed it. And now I'm sure, it's the bear in the corner that you can't unnotice once you see it.
You can't go to a museum with me. I have a good friend, Gretel Rodriguez, who's in art history at Brown, and she goes with me places, and like she now knows to send me pictures if she's somewhere. I get a text message with an image, but you have to have a very understanding friend, because I just walk around faceless, like I'm talking to myself, like there's another one. I'm not a lot of fun.
Well, so now when you go to a museum, be on the lookout for the faceless. Be on the lookout for the wands, because you should be asking some questions about maybe where they came from, what they're representing, what they say about us, and how we feel about them, as well as a whole other thing to unpack for yourself as you look at these. Dr. Walsh, thank you so much for taking the time to walk through some wand and some surprise statuary bonus material added on top. I really appreciate it. The article is wonderful. It's going to be linked down in the description. If you liked this, go and read it and be on the lookout for more. But Dr. Walsh, again, thank you for taking the time to come and join us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun for me to talk about. And I appreciate the opportunity to kind of pitch some new ideas. So thank you for that.
Always wonderful to hear new ideas. I can't wait. I look forward to seeing where it goes, and happy to talk to you whenever you want about where you're at with it. For this week, we'll leave you there, audience, to spin in all of that material and consider it for yourself. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you find us. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. But for this week, for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.